Good morning, everyone. This is Jeff Becker, the Vice Chair of CASH and also with the Fresno County Superintendent of Schools. Just a quick note before Julie starts us off this morning that the audio for today's webinar is through your computer speakers and not through the phone system. So please make sure that you have your computer speakers on so that you can hear the audio from today's broadcast.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Hi, everyone, and a very pleasant good morning to you. Great, thank you, Jeff. Hi, everyone, and a very pleasant good morning to you, wherever you may be. Hope you and your family are safe and healthy. As Jeff said, I'm Julie Arthur. I'm the CASH Chair, and I'm Executive Director of Facilities Planning for Palm Springs Unified School District. Last week, the CASH, we presented the third webinar on K-12 in the coronavirus environment. If you were able to watch it, it spotlighted the vital importance of schools and district staff in the fight against the coronavirus. For questions with answers to these that were presented during the webinar, please visit the CASH website. Click on the COVID-19 link to see this info. Today is the fourth in the series of webinars, and it focuses on the future state and local bonds, alternative capital funding and availability options, and planning during the coronavirus crisis. We're going to hear from pollsters and what they have gleaned from a post-Prop 13 election survey and what type of funding strategies to focus on in the future. CASH has a long history of working with our pollsters, and we try and gather as much data as possible to dissect what we were up against and how to plan for future state bond sales. As you saw earlier this morning, Jeff is sharing the screen with me, and Jeff, again, he's our CASH Vice Chair and with the Fresno County Superintendent of Schools office. And with that, Jeff Springs here. How are things going in Fresno area, and what's happening with county schools in your area?
Well, we are as busy as ever. This week we had the latest. Where we now have in the city of Fresno a mandatory facial covering order in place. So we are wearing masks all the time when we're in the office now, and really dealing with jurisdictions of all of these different. There you go, Julie. With all of the different orders and school districts work through that. We do weekly phone calls with all of our school districts on a variety of topics. So we're certainly staying busy with staying on top of all of the latest guidance and requirements that are coming out. And we're becoming adept at teleworking and Zoom calls as well. How about you in Palm Springs?
We are afloat and moving along. We've had, as I said last week, different cities have instituted different orders. We are fortunate right now that we do have some remaining local bond funds that we're not dependent on the state funding right now, as most of our projects we're doing this summer are actually redevelopment projects. It is interesting times, and I will definitely be interested to see what our webinar presenters have to say today on what our funding options going forward are going to be. So with that, let's go ahead and we'll get. I'll hand that over to you if you want to do a few more housekeeping issues.
Sure. Yeah, just a couple of housekeeping items for today's webinar. After each presentation section, Dr. Tom Duffy, Julie, and myself may ask a few brief questions. We also have listening in Ian Padilla, who's a legislative advocate with CASH, who is monitoring the chat box, which is in the bottom left corner of the screen. Feel free to type questions in there. And as time allows, we can discuss those questions at the end of the broadcast. It is being recorded for future viewing. As Julie mentioned, the previous ones are now on the CASH website. And before I introduce our speakers, let me just add one other thing that's been a big topic of discussion around our office, and that's the overall budget picture for schools for the next couple of years, and it's dusting off the playbook from the Great Recession to see what worked well as we went through that, in case we are looking at that in the future. And again, like you, Julie, we have a lot of districts who are reevaluating their bond programs and which projects who are reevaluating their bond programs and which projects are critical in light of the election that we just had and the results of that. So let me introduce our panelists that we have today. We're joined by Rick Sklarz with Fairbank, Moslin, Mullen, Metz and Rick Sklarz with Fairbank, Moslin, Mullen, Metz and Associates, also known as FM3 Research. We also have John Barrissey, CASH board member with Raymond James and Associates, Matt Petler with School Facility Consultants, Larry Fashaw, a CASH board member, can share with us your research on the March election results.
Great. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. This is Rick Sklarz from FM3 Research. I'm just going to take you briefly through some of the major findings from a survey we conducted a couple weeks ago, March 24th through the 31st. It was with, I'm just going to sort of briefly go through that and give you some overview. And sort of, obviously the big thing was the defeat of Prop 13, the statewide school bond measure, and a number of local school districts not passing bonds as well. And our research really suggests this was no sort of single answer heard in sort of a fashion that maybe was not expected and certainly historically has not happened like this in quite a while. And I think first we're all very focused on the COVID right now, COVID-19, coronavirus, and the impact it's having. But prior to, the impact it's having, but prior to, the beginning of March, if you put yourself back in sort of a framework of where we were in January, February, it was really housing, the cost of living, the affordable housing crisis, the sense that everything costs too much in California. That was really the sense that everything costs too much in California. That was really the dominant issue and concern of voters. And what we kept seeing from, from the last summer into the fall and through the winter, voters increasingly growing more negative and pessimistic. The governor's name ID, his favorability rating, growing more negative and pessimistic. The governor's name ID, his favorability rating had fallen below 50%. Now that's shot back up now, as many of you have seen in polling that's come out, and that's what our polling showed as well. But prior to the election, voters were in a really sort of negative mood in a way that they hadn't been in quite a while. The election, voters were in a really sort of negative mood in a way that they hadn't been in quite a while. And that led into why voters who say they voted against Prop 13 and local school bonds really drove their vote, which was they were concerned about wasteful spending, something we always hear, throughout research about, on measures, concern about wasteful spending, debt, the driving up of state debt, and then taxes. How is this going to impact me at the local level, paying higher property taxes? So those issues that are always there were here again, but maybe a little more intensely felt given sort of the dynamic of, what we were up against. And some other factors that we didn't necessarily have control over us. The turnout doesn't appear to be as significant as a lot of people thought it was going to be. The progressive Bernie Sanders driven turnout, didn't really materialize. And what we're seeing is that, a lot of younger Democrat voters are not disproportionately more likely to have voted in this primary election than they were 4 years ago in the presidential primary of 2016. So things did not sort of take shape the way a lot of people projected it. Then we had some other obstacles to voting that particularly impact the voters supportive of bond measures statewide and locally. And these tend to be Democrats, voters under the age of 40, Latinos, and LA County voters. And, sort of the basic reasons, yes, of, couldn't get time off from work, but also, and this was particularly LA County having issues in implementing its new voting system, very long lines at the polls. So lots of voters didn't even sort of see an opportunity. I'm not going to wait hours upon hours, don't have that luxury to do it. And then another factor sort of towards the tail end of the race or the election was the consolidation of the Democratic presidential field. And we saw among Democratic voters in our survey, a lot of people saying, I didn't vote because the person I wanted to vote for had dropped out by the time the election rolled around. A few other factors to note. We've heard a lot about Prop 13. It's sort of, we got stuck with a note we've heard a lot about Prop 13. It's sort of, we got stuck with it. We couldn't do anything about it. And I don't want to claim that this is the reason why we lost, but it's not an insignificant reason either. There's clearly a lot of voters out there who this rings a bell in their head and they see Prop 13 and they don't want to change that law. And so it does have some cachet, particularly, it's going to naturally be older voters who recall it more than younger voters. I think one of the other factors here is the size of the bond, the largest one in state history for schools. And part of that was an additional $4 billion for the research are consistently seen as needing less funding than K through 12 or community colleges. So, more money, of which a chunk of it is going to some organizations that voters are not as prioritized. So that factor. And then sort of late in the election, right, as things were sort of happening with the coronavirus, but primarily overseas, but it started to impact the stock market. And so we saw within a 2-week period, mid-February, the stock market hit its all-time high, over 29,000. The Dow Jones then dropped 4,000 points in February. I think it was 28, 29, something like that. And so late deciders seeing that, what's the impact? Again, we know the economy, housing issues, cost of living were impacted, were issues leading in. This may have impacted people later. In our research, for the voters who were voting and saying that this was a concern to them, they were more likely to be people who are traditional supporters of bond measures, Democrats, voters of color, people in the urban areas like the Bay Area and Los Angeles County. And so this factor played a larger role in whether they would not vote because they did not want to go to the polls where, they thought there was a health concern if I had to wait in a long line, particularly the LA County issue. So that played a role in that last that last weekend when we would expect a big turnout to hopefully push our vote up. And then lastly, bonds, AB 195. We've seen for the past several years in our research, this AB 195 factor is a significant impact. It does hurt local bond support. The more language dedicated to the fiscal tax issues, voters see that, as well as less opportunity to describe tax issues. Voters see that, as well as less opportunity to describe projects in the 75-word ballot statement. So those continue to be factors. Now I'm going to get into some data, and I'm just showing you here on this slide, in our research, the post-election survey, the March 2020 vote that we got in our research, the post-election survey, the March 2020 vote that we got in our survey versus a survey we did in October 2019 for the coalition that was working on what ultimately became Prop 13 when we were testing the bond measure. And what you can see here is the decline in support between the bond measure. And what you can see here is the decline in support between March 2020 from October 2019 survey. Look at Democrats. In March 2020, the vote on Prop 13, 63% of Democrats said they voted yes, 24% no. Prior, 3% of Democrats said they voted yes, 24% no. Prior to that, in October, we were at 81% yes and 14% no with Democrats. A big drop-off in support among Democratic vote, which is absolutely critical to these types of measures. As you can see, Republicans pretty much stayed opposed throughout. We also lost 10 points with independent voters. Younger voters, a little bit of a drop-off, but not as significant as voters over the age of 40, where we were above 50% with those voters and then under 40%. Otherwise, a 16-point drop among white voters, 10 points among Latinos, and a shockingly high drop-off among Asian Pacific Islanders who, really that may have been an impact, whether that's the Bay Area issues going on, with COVID, it's unclear, but that was a really, and then going down regionally, you can see the one that's very dramatic is the Bay Area. We had 69% voting yes in our October survey, and the post-election survey, it dropped to 48%. Basically, Bay Area has to be at least 2/3 or higher For basically, Bay Area has to be at least 2/3 or higher for these types of measures. That's the liberal base of the vote throughout the state. To not get over 50% there is extremely problematic for a statewide ballot measure. LA County, you can see, is the only place where we're over 50%, but even there, we're not much there. LA County, you can see, is the only place where we're over 50%, but even there, we're not much there, over 50%. And then in the rest of the state, San Diego, a little better, but the other portions of the state, pretty low. So why did people vote yes for a statewide bond for the Prop 13? The reasons that they voted yes remain consistent, which is the critical need to get rid of hazardous materials, make schools and classrooms healthy and safe for students, whether that's getting rid of mold, lead paint, and asbestos. Over 50% say that's an extremely important reason for why they voted yes on Prop 13. Fixing plumbing, leaky roofs, extremely important reason, over 90% when you add the very important. Secondarily, what's here is also accountability, making sure funds are spent as promised. So you can see here, voters want to make sure that their tax dollars are being used as promised, efficiently, and not wasted here to continue to get that information out to the public. And then on this list, you can also see very high level support for improving classroom technology, labs, libraries, resources. So upgrading the critical resources for education remain important as well. And these are all what we continue to see statewide. These are very consistent. On the other side, those who voted no, the reasons they primarily voted no were what we would expect no voters usually do say. They think the money's going to be wasted. You can see that at the very top of the list. It would have, resulted in more debt that requires more property taxes. The big impact on the state budget. Why should we be doing this? We have a surplus. That issue may sort of be no longer true, but when we were in the bond measure world, we were prior to COVID. And you can see here, second from the bottom, the issue of Prop 13. Second from the bottom, the issue of Prop 13. Again, it's not the sort of very strong reason that, waste or debt in taxes is, but for a number of voters, 4 in 10, it's an extremely important reason to vote against a measure that they perceive as trying to change Proposition 13. And then below that, they perceive as trying to change Proposition 13. And then below that, the idea that voters just approved a bond for $9 billion in 2016. So that, again, not the biggest reason, but not insignificant as well, about 2/3 saying extremely or very important. Voted against local school bond measures. And again, it's very similar in the sense of taxes, fiscal concerns, taxes, raising the cost of living, again, increase their property taxes, wasteful spending. At the bottom, what I think is notable here is the economy. So that's not necessarily their key reason. And above that, not to say it's insignificant, but it's a lower level reason. Past school bond measure has been approved. Why should we do another? That one, again, not the critical reason to vote against it. But primarily it's what we saw at the state bond, debt, cost of living, those concerns. So I want to sort of conclude just by sort of where do we go from here? I think the issue that we would say is, and we work at the statewide and local level with many districts, probably some of the people who are on this call right now. You don't need to be as right for you. We're obviously in a very dynamic, complex time. What we're doing, we're working with a number of districts across the state. It might be useful to do a shorter, more condensed survey, test what people are thinking right now. You don't need to decide yet, obviously. It needs to be placed on the November ballot, isn't until sort of the latter half, in late July, early August. So you have time to decide and don't need to sort of say yes or no now. Flexibility is always important. These are always things that need, things happen and you need to change things. So, and mentioned earlier, what Great Recession, which basically a lot of districts have put bond measures on in 2008, and then in the fall, the bottom fell out. But ultimately, virtually over 90% of these measures were approved. So turbulence doesn't necessarily prevent you from going to the ballot. It's something to just keep in mind. Priorities. I think we, can see that there's a reason why voters would say certain things are higher priorities now, whether that's, online learning technology that needs to be invested in, meal delivery, upgrading health services for students, cleaning classroom buildings to make sure they're safe, for everyone. And then finally, economic development. A school bond injects funds into a community for construction, repair. So all of this information can be helpful in creating an opportunity. And then maintaining can be helpful in creating an opportunity. And then maintaining effective communications is essential. We're seeing voters, the community, the public, people want to be informed. Obviously, the coronavirus has done a lot to the public about concerns. They want to know what's happening. They want to know what's going on. And making sure districts can continue to communicate, not just with their parents, but also the broader community is going to be important. And so I think, that's sort of where we are now. We think it's, doesn't mean we should go forward or shouldn't go forward, but the opportunity to, stay engaged with the community and see what their priorities are is valuable. Hand it back over to our leaders.
Thank you, Rick. Really interesting information. I know we talked a little bit in there. You were actually the COVID-19. Having our election on March 3rd down the public health yet. How did that COVID-19? It's hard to kind of grasp that a little bit. Mm-hmm. Let's go this way. How soon did you actually do the survey after the election?
So our survey was conducted from March 24th through the 31st. So we're about 3 weeks after the election we did the survey. And what we
Sorry to interrupt, but Julie, could you mute your computer, please?
So what we saw in our research is as we got closer to election day, we asked people when they voted. Did you vote by mail and early? And so people, voted at various times. What's interesting about this election, it sort of goes into the Democratic presidential primary, there were a lot of voters who held onto their ballots towards the end, particularly Democrats, because they wanted to wait until sort of the field was clear. If you sort of think back, the South Carolina primary, Biden wins pretty substantially. There's a primary, Biden wins pretty substantially. There's a bunch of candidates start dropping out and sort of coalesce around him. So we sort of had a Democratic vote that was waiting to the end, didn't vote early. And by the time COVID-19 sort of really started us here in California, and you can see it, we first saw it in the Bay Area really, those voters who cast their ballot late, particularly the weekend before, the days before the election, we did not get the kind of support we would have expected from Democrats, younger voters, progressive, that we normally would. A lot of that may have been concerns economically, but there may also have been a big sort of group of voters. We saw that in our research. About 100 or so of our respondents in this survey said they did not vote in March. And for the people who did not vote, a lot of them said at the very end because of the coronavirus. And so as we got closer to election day, coronavirus became a bigger factor in why people said they did not vote or said it impacted how they voted.
Okay.
Rick,
wow.
Rick, this is Tom Did, and I just appreciated your answer to Julie. Just because you do this is what you live and breathe every day. And you'd said early on, there was no single reason for what happened during this rather unusual election. But knowing what you know and knowing what you feel is sort of would you say that our school district members and private sector members that really want to try to look ahead, what should they really be concerned about? What is the single thing that should be on their mind?
I think it's two halves of the same coin, which is one, we have to make sure it's two halves of the same coin, which is, one, we have to make sure voters believe that the funds used by bonds are going to be used in the way that the districts claim that they will, that there is not going to be excessive bureaucratic overhead. There's not going to be excessive bureaucratic overhead. There's not going to be wasteful spending. That we have to show them and prove to them that if you approve this measure, you're going to get what we say we're going to do. And as part of that, we have to understand now is projects that they want done. What are they? Do they continue to be the sort of bread and butter that we've always seen as being important to voters and in the survey, which are, making the classroom safe, addressing issues of leaky roofs, pipes, mold, asbestos, whatever those may be, those critical, certain things voters want to see given the climate we're in right now. Whether that is things like making sure kids can learn online, getting them the resources they need. So if we're in home, for an extended period of time, or, unfortunately, if we have a second wave and we have to go through this again, we aren't going to have a huge disruption. Or do we, as well as, and it doesn't have to be or, and, it could be an and, what is the benefit of a school bond, not just to the parents and the teachers and the students, but also the broader community? And if you can prove to them that, hey, we're going to rebuild this school, prove to them that, hey, we're going to rebuild this school, our economy is suffering right now. This is money from our community going back into our community. It's going to create jobs for local residents. It's going to create economic opportunities for local small businesses, and it's going to help restart the economy at a time that businesses, and it's going to help restart the economy at a time that we really need something. And it's locally controlled, the state, federal, nobody else gets this money. We get it to decide how it's used here in our community.
Okay, thank you, Rick. Okay, thank you, Rick.
All right, well, why don't we next go up? Let's go. We've got lots of questions on the screen. Like we said, we're going to take those questions and we'll provide answers and put them up on the CASH website. But let's start our next slide with John Barrissey. He's a CASH board member, Raymond James and Associate, and Matt Pedler with School Facility Consultants. They're going to talk about state bond funding status, stretching local bonds, CFDs, bridge financing, and other tools. Great. Hey, John.
Hey, Julie. Thanks, and for some important issues that we're facing here moving forward. So I'm going to cover, to give everyone on the line here, let's take a look at this page 12, this graph. So if you are a district that was looking at selling bonds here over the past 30 days or have been preparing to issue bonds, your financial advisor or underwriter, and just what's been going on in the marketplace. And I think that, this disruption that we've seen with respect to the coronavirus, has really shocked the markets. And I think at the end of this discussion, we'll be in a place of somewhat comfort, ability to access the market at favorable interest rates. But to give you a sense on how the reaction, was taken in with respect to investors and municipal bonds. You can see this chart. This is for tax-exempt bonds, really going back to the beginning of interest rates. And, going to March 2020, here you see it, interest rates jumped, almost 2.5% in 2 days, which was an unprecedented move. And then as the CARE package, the CARES Act, was implemented and signed, and then it's been very volatile up and down. And then now over the past 2 weeks or so, I would say we've seen a general, steadiness of the municipal market trending lower. So that's great for districts that are, taking a look at selling bonds. And, good news, good news today, actually, this morning, I've been following my email here. The state of California sold 1.5 billion of general obligation bonds. $615 million of that was for new projects, and the other million of that was for new projects, and the other 800 and change was for refinancing. So, you know, that $1.5 billion was very well received, which is great. It sets the tone for the local issuers, like all the K-12 school districts that are listening in. So that's good. That are listening in. So that's good. I think that's setting a precedent through all the volatility we've had over the past month. That items are starting to stabilize. So, taking a look, I also wanted to hover on taxable bonds and interest rates. And if you're a district that has outstanding bonds and interest rates, and if you're a district that has outstanding bonds that were issued anywhere between the past 5 to 8 years, you've probably been taking a look at refinancing outstanding general obligation bonds or certificates of participation or potentially special tax bonds with taxable bonds. It's called a taxable advance refunding. So you can see here, it's a little bit of a different chart than the previous one. And, you know, the Treasury rates have generally been dipping pretty dramatically. And we saw an all-time low for the United States 10-year Treasury, which is a baseline security for taxable bonds for municipal issuers. And, you know, a little bit of a pop. So it's been interesting. You know, districts that were looking at refinancing are basically on the bench right now because there's been so much corporate debt through the stock market crisis. Corporations have been issuing taxable bonds, corporate bonds, which in tune has really, while these baseline interest rates have remained low, the credit rates have been really impacted by the corporate debt issuance that we've seen. So that's starting to slow. And I think what you'll see is some of those refundings or refinancings that districts may have that are sitting on the bench may come back and, you know, make sense and be able to achieve that for your local taxpayers. Make sense and be able to achieve that for your local taxpayers. So the next slide I have is just to show you how dramatic, you know, this past month or so has been for the municipal marketplace. And as you can see here, you know, looking at that chart on the top, you can see those light blue bars. That's the supply that we've seen over the past, you know, year to date. And you can just see how it's diminished from February being at an all-time, you know, a very high spot given the past several years because interest rates were so low. Then the volatility starts with the spike, and now the leveling of more stabilization. In March and April, you can see that you know, the volume has gone way down. And the chart on the bottom is one too that, you know, we've used in many presentations before, but you can see on the far right, and we've used in many presentations before, but you can see on the far right and take a look at, you know, these various points in time where you see the red. You know, in November and December of 2016 is when we had a presidential election with the outcome that wasn't expected. Investors took their money out of bonds and put them into stock. So you see a lot of those outflows from the municipal funds that invest in municipal bonds. And the same sort of thing happened in this particular crisis, where in March and April of this year, you see just very large dramatic withdrawal. It seems like it was more temporary. And over time, you know, we're hoping that continues to improve and municipal issuers get the chance to take a benefit of the lower interest rate environment that we're generally still in. So the good news is if you're the district looking to sell GO bonds, you know, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape to still get almost than what you may have seen in the past with you've issued bonds. Moving forward to the next slide, I did want to cover this briefly. I think folks, you know, are interested in this CARES Act and does it have anything for facilities or maintenance and operations? And, you know, I want to generally keep this discussion to facilities, but I think it's important to know that the CARES Act, you know, does authorize a couple of items called the Municipal Liquidity Facility that I'm going to turn to on this page here. And this is of interest to, you know, California school districts cannot, and this is of interest to, you know, California school districts cannot borrow themselves through this particular piece just because they don't meet the eligible entities requirement, which I think you can probably see my mouse here. which is in this section where it's states and DC and cities with more than DC and cities with more than 1 million residents and also counties with more than 2 million residents are authorized borrowers from this Federal Reserve Bank program that will help the deficits that school districts are going to see through their budgets potentially by issuing TANs, trans, bond anticipation notes up to 24 months. So what you'll probably see is either the state of California, they have the capacity based upon the calculation, which is this loan size right here, number 2, that up to 20% of the general revenue, 17, gives you the number or the bogey per se that states and counties could borrow. So as an example, state of California, they have the authority to borrow almost up to $40 billion for this particular purpose. And you can see how the flow chart works here, but how this works in the other entities, which would be qualified K-12 school districts. In the state of California, we don't know how this is going to work yet. So, but this is conceptually how this will work for budget shortfalls and such. So pretty interesting. It'll be interesting to see how it follows and follows through. We'll see how they go. And I would say for facilities wise, what does this mean? What does this all mean? So we have these interest rate movements. We have these federal programs starting to kick in. And then we also have the talk at the federal level of infrastructure and how is that going to impact school districts, in particular here in California, components to a federal Phase 4 bill that could include, previously authorized tools such as qualified school improvement bonds, construction bonds they would be called improvement bonds in this wave, potentially QZABs, maybe a CREB, some of spur issuance and such, depending on how this crisis goes. So I think we'll see. I would say if you're just going through these various types of bonds that are actively issued for construction of school facilities, GO bonds, they're the most, I think, they're the most, I think, protected security through this process, as the property taxes get levied regardless. And, you're based on, fluctuating assessed valuation. But the one item I would say is that when you take a look at the next item, certificates of participation, lease revenue bonds, and other general fund obligations, there's permanent general fund financings that are done to, bridge gaps between GO bond programs, state funds, and other local revenues, and also the bridge financings. And I would say that the one thing I do see that is, and also the bridge financings. And I would say that the one thing I do see that to keep a close watch on is that the credit of California school districts and how that's going to play out with respect to the second item, because school districts are losing revenue. Those are obviously pledged revenues towards, the debt service on these types of obligations. So those may be a little bit tricky. It'll be just one of those things just to flat out watch as this develops over the next couple of months to see, district's ability to issue. And I think as long as there are sound repayment plans, so that part of the market will continue. But, as part as bridge financings and other revenues that'll be used, it's just going to be important to pay close attention. And special tax bonds, the high yield market, depending on, the type of special yield market, depending on, the type of special tax bonds that are issued, those will be credit driven. And the ones that are lower, it's more speculative in this marketplace, it'll be interesting to see how the Fed gets involved and maybe assists in purchasing some of these bonds. But, I think that's these bonds, but, I think that's just to be determined here moving forward. So a lot of information there, but I think overall, it's been a very volatile 45 days. And in general, the markets for municipal bonds are stabilizing, so obviously with your consultants, and you should be in reasonable shape to go out to the market. We're starting to just see the market flooded with issuance now over the past 2 weeks as we've started to see the stabilization in tax exempt rates. So with that, that concludes the discussion here on current status of state bond funds.
Thanks, John. Morning, everybody. Before I get started on state bond funds, I'm going to let everybody know that my next laptop is going to have the camera at the top, so I don't get this nice upshot of my face that I'm sure everybody enjoys. But I'm going to talk state bond funds and then talk about some of the actions that OPSC and the State Allocation Board have authorized and taken so far related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So in terms of state bond funds, Rick went through Prop 13 and some of the, and as we know, that is not a good situation for state bond funds, because we were hoping that would inject new funding into the program, because Prop 51 new construction and modernization funds are currently oversubscribed. It's been that way for quite a while. But the program, and I think it's an important point, that the state funding program is not shut down. And in fact, it's very active. And as I'm going to talk about on this slide, there's a lot of money that still needs to get out to projects and to districts for projects. So while new construction and modernization is oversubscribed, the state is continuing to accept new construction. So while new construction and modernization is oversubscribed, the state is continuing to accept new construction and modernization applications. As of March 31 of last month, there's about $1.7 billion in new construction and modernization projects in line outside of modernization projects in line outside of Prop 51. So as we know, folks on this call, the need continues, and the good news is that the state continues to accept those applications. There's also a lot of the Prop 51 money that still needs to be allocated. $5.1 billion that is still within the bond that hasn't been apportioned and funded to projects. OPSC is actively processing applications. They're doing it at about a rate of $125 million a month, which is consistent with under the bond sales of about $1.5 billion. That $125 a month gets you to about $1.5 billion a year. The 1920 state budget included an amount of $1.5 billion in bond sales for projects. Governor Newsom's significant increase from the Brown budget amounts. That bond allocation is in two chunks, $750 million in the fall roughly, and $750 million in the spring. The fall 19 apportionment happened. The spring, but are going to happen next month according to OPSC, and we're anticipating that the full amount of authorization is going to be funded so that we will hit that approximately $1.5 billion. Essentially all the unfunded projects that want their apportionments should get those that were eligible for the PIF for the spring sale. There is still some opportunity for new money. Health and safety tops the list. So the state is processing a prioritized list. So the state is processing, prioritizing and funding facility hardship health and safety projects as well as seismic projects. So if you have those types of projects, make sure that you are submitting them. And the state has funding set aside currently to fund those projects. There's also still about $250 million in career tech education funding available. I'll talk a little bit about that more on the next slide, but that is funding that is still authorized under 51 and yet to be funded. That I always try to weave into all my presentations is to continue to get in line for funding, always get in line for funding. We're in an extreme amount of uncertainty, but I can guarantee you if you don't get in line for funding, you will not get any money from the state bond, current or future. So keep submitting those applications. Specific to COVID-19, on March 25th, 2020, the Allocation Board adopted a regulation that gave OPSC and their executive officer emergency powers to extend deadlines with a 180-day sunset. We'll 180-day sunset. We'll see kind of the full extent to how that authorization is used, but in a few key ways we've already seen it since the board meeting last March. The first one that I've noted is that the CTE last March. The first one that I've noted is that the CTE submittal deadline has been extended. The OPSC submittal for the current round of CTE projects was originally the beginning of April. That's been extended to June 30th. That's good news if you have a qualifying score and haven't submitted an application. June 30th. That's good news if you have a qualifying score and haven't submitted an application. You've got more time to do that. It also means that the approval of those projects will be delayed, however, by about 3 months is what we're anticipating, given that they've delayed the submittal. About 3 months is what we're anticipating, given that they've delayed the submittal deadline about 3 months. The last budget allocated $250 million for full-day kindergarten funding program, which was a very popular program under the prior budget. That program, however, has been postponed, put on hold. That is general fund money, so we may be seeing a situation where that money is reallocated through the budget process, and so that program is currently on hold. Another deadline that OPSC and the State Allocation Board unfunded approval by June in order to submit a request to participate in that round. That has been extended to the end of August. So now projects that have unfunded approvals through the end of August can participate for a fall 2020 bond sale. We'll have to see what that looks like, that $1 billion. It's yet to see how next budget cycle and apportionments are affected for the 2021 budget year. The budget proposal had the full $1.5 billion in it, but we've had a lot happen since then. We may see some changes, but that's a stay tuned. OPSC also on the processing side is granting deadline requests. So if you're actively working on a project with them where you have a 15-day letter or a 4-day letter, they are granting extensions. They have a form on their website where you can make that request. They also should be open to conversations about program deadlines. So if on the ground you're having construction issues, timing issues related to fund release deadlines, substantial progress, spending the money, those types of things, we haven't come across those yet in our work, but they should be working with you to extend those deadlines as well. And I think the $1 million question that I'll end with is, will all this uncertainty, which will likely lead to state budget uncertainty, will that lead to funding delays? It may. We're seeing some of the deadlines pushed back. The state may have their budget issues, which affect bond funding. We also, though, know, and I know Rick mentioned when he was talking about local bonds, that school construction projects stimulate the economy and help restart the economy. We saw that with local bonds coming out of the Great Recession, and saw that with state bonds then as well. Tuned on that and see what happens. I think the May revise will be our first indicator officially on that, and we'll be tracking that as we move forward. So if I end there on state funding, I'll pass it along to Larry and Terry. Thank you.
While we're waiting for Terry, just the recommendation that you would make, you're an expert in this, and you sense what districts are doing and what they're not doing. Are districts waiting to line up for funding, such as the facility hardship, waiting to line up for funding, such as the facility hardship and seismic funding? Are people being timid about things today because of what we're going through, or are they seeking this funding? What's your sense of that?
My sense is that districts aren't.
They seeking this funding. What's your sense of that?
My sense is that districts aren't being timid about it, and my advice would be not to be. You know, as I mentioned earlier, and we can see by the amount of projects that are in line for funding, the need persists, and your needs locally persist. And on projects that are in line for funding, the need persists, and your needs locally persist. And I think that you always need to be full throttle in pursuit of funding. You know, another thing I mentioned about the state bond funds is you don't have to commit to spending the money until you can execute a contract. So there is time, effort, expense to getting in line for funding, but it doesn't obligate you, you know, to move forward on an immediate timeline. And hopefully, you know, we're dealing with this pandemic and issues around it. Hopefully, when we come out of this, you know, that will put you in a place to have funding available to move projects forward. So I haven't seen a lot of timidness, Tom, and I would encourage, as I have said before, that districts move forward as aggressively as they can.
And something that are looking for the demonstration of need, and a school district applying for funding, especially at this point in time, identifying that they're spending time and resources to line up for state bond funds because there's need, and they are able to then use that as a demonstration to the community of indicator. Thank you, Matt.
Absolutely. Yep. Being able to show that leverage play is huge for your overall building program.
Larry.
All right. Well, we're still ahead of my son's trombone. Zoom lessons, so I know that's my favorite part of the day. So I want to make sure to finish before that to get started. But wanted to talk about. Actually, I'm going to let Terry go ahead and get started because it looks like his slides are up first. We're going to talk about developer fees and different ways of utilizing those and maximizing those, as well as working with assets and surplus properties.
Thank you.
COVID-19. And some of those will definitely affect the ability to sell property. We have seen that property values appear to be fluctuating and appear to be going on the downward trend. So most school districts probably are not going to be due the surplus property in order to at least poise themselves for future sale or perhaps even future leasing of the property. We looked a lot more at some of your other options because some of your goals for school districts generally are to come up with alternative funding sources, allow school districts to do something perhaps other than just put it into capital facilities. If you look at the surplus property requirements, there is a section that basically says you must make the sale of surplus properties. That's generally accepted as an exception. So I'm putting up on the screen some of the options that we typically look at: sale, leasing, licensing, joint use. The one that is rarely used, but perhaps the most one, land development, which I call when you have fee-producing possibilities with regard to the property. I'll just generally cover surplus is Education Code Section 17388. It's fairly common. Education Code Section 17388. It's fairly common. You go through 7-Eleven committee. Most people have done it. The difficulty that I've always had with surplus is there's application of Mailer Act. That's Ed Code Section 17485. That's Ed Code Section 17485. That application of Mailer Act means that you could have up to 30% of your available property that was used in the past for recreational purposes sold at a 25% a 25% of the property value. So that doesn't work very well in order to maximize the value of properties when you have cities or other recreational districts looking at you. So that's why I look a lot more at some of these other opportunities. Joint use, a lot more at some of these other opportunities. Joint use is typically when you are working with another public entity or private entity. It allows you to develop a piece of property for this joint use or joint occupancy. I'll give you a really good example of one that we did fairly recently. We had a school district that had a fairly sizable piece of property. What they did was they came to us and they said, we would like to retain some of this property for a develop in order to make income. So the developer qualifications were reviewed, RFQs were sent out, and ultimately we established that 600,000 square feet of warehouses would be built. And the result would be a 60,000 square foot part of the compensation for the lease of the overall properties for joint use, joint occupancy purposes. If you go by what it is that most people tell you, the last project you ever do often is the district essentially nothing other than a piece of property. And it was up to the developer to figure out how this was going to work. We have the property being transferred back to the school district the moment that the district office is built. Most of the key contract provisions are governing how the district office. So we found this to be a really useful tool, especially for a school district that has lots of property. You may not be in that situation where you have lots of property, but this is one that actually worked really well. So there was a code change recently worked really well. So there was a code change recently on this joint occupancy. I'll mention it. If you look at an old code, if you haven't had one updated on your bookshelf for a little while, it used to say 66 years. Last year, the code was updated to 99 years, which is similar to what it is that you encountered. Updated to 99 years, which is similar to what it is that you encountered with regard to surplus property. When you do surplus, you could also lease property, and doing a lease will provide you the ability to go out, look at different people who might be able to use the property. I use something called a strawberry field analogy. If you took an empty piece of property or even a property that had a building on it, roughly the fair market value for leasing of the fair market value of the property per year. So you can take your valuation, multiply by 7%, that will give you a yearly cost. You divide that by 12, and that'll get you a monthly cost, and that's what you will give to your lessor as your base rent, and then you can negotiate it from there. The market, you might go higher or lower. I will warn you, with many school districts created their own market with regards to leases for schools. So many school districts lease their property for under fair market value, and appraisers have generally told me that a lot under fair market value, and appraisers have generally told me that a lot of the leases are below fair market value. So just a quick warning to all of you. This section, Government Code Section 5956, is for what's called fee-producing facilities projects. If you look at the statute, it is an unusual statute, and it's available and was originally developed primarily for infrastructure projects. That's for utilities, water districts, it does include school districts. The most common use of this code section is for parking structures in non-charter cities. So if you park in a parking structure in a non-charter city and it's owned by the municipality, most cities are used to pay for the project itself. So in your case, you could use this statute in order to build a project as long as it's going to be fee producing. I'll give you a couple of examples. We had a school district that built an El Pollo Loco. We had a school district that built an auto parts store and another that built a senior housing facility, all of which fit under this 5956. So what's required is an RFP. You have to adopt a procedure that says that you are not going to enter into any improper or corrupt transactions, and you have to comply with your typical local requirements. So that would be CEQA, and also you're going to have to get your local approvals. So for the purposes of doing some of these projects, you may actually run into the situation where if you've been paying attention to the legislature and what they've been doing for multifamily, there appears to be some new legislation that may be helpful, which is that could be used for workforce housing. One is SB 35 and one is SB 50. They're both Wiener bills. They give a little bit of priority to school district, to multifamily loans are just above what is called low income. So we've been playing around with perhaps seeking some additional legislation in order to help the workforce housing. Down at the bottom of the page, I'll just note for you really quickly that there is this method to not include sporting and entertainment locations. So you can't use it for a recreational facility. You can't use it for creating a stadium or anything like that in order to generate income. This is more your traditional. So for example, an offer similar to lease-leaseback, it hasn't been invaded by any of the other requirements that have come in with regard to lease-leaseback. So it's just a clean statute that says you can do this as long as you make a determination that this project is going to be fee producing. And
all right, well, thanks, Terry. If I could borrow your background for the discussion on developer fees, that would be ideal to kind of set the mood. But what are developer fees? Again, this is a refresher for everybody that they are fees paid by developers of new residential or commercial industrial projects to mitigate the impact that those projects have on the need for school facilities. So new houses, new businesses produce more kids. More kids means the need for additional facilities, either new schools or expansions to schools, or we'll talk about later on enhancements and modernizations of school facilities. And, you know, given where we are with the economy, with the impacts of COVID-19, you know, developer fees are one of those revenue sources that may be declining as a result of decreased demand for new housing, with the economic recession that we are likely to be seeing. But this recession is likely different than the one we saw in 2008, 2009, which was real estate driven. So we'll have to keep an eye on what things look like as the housing market responds to the pandemic and how quickly any changes are seen one way or the other and as it relates to building of new homes across the state. Refresher again, level 1 fees are the rates that districts are allowed to charge. There's an amount set by the state allocation board every year based in stat index every 2 years, by the state allocation board. Level 2 and 3 fees are the alternative fees. that districts that meet certain statutory requirements are allowed to charge. These are rates that are calculated individually within each district based on a formula provided in statute. Level 2 fees are supposed to represent 50% of the cost of growth. But we know that that number is below what it in reality because of the per pupil grant construction amounts that are used to determine level 2 fees, not representing the actual cost of construction. Level 3 fees are intended to represent 100% of cost of growth and were implemented or are to be implemented when state bonds have been exhausted. Those were triggered in 2016 by the State Allocation Board. And based on the statute, there's really no undoing of level 3 fees. So I know some districts that charge level 3 fees have gone back to level 2 fees once they started receiving state funds, but there's actually nothing in the statute that talks about rescission of level 3 fees. Go to the next slide and we'll talk about Proposition 13 again, kind of bookend the beginning part of the workshop. If there is a silver lining in Prop 13's results, it would be the elements that would have impacted developer fees not taking effect. So we talked a lot about these elements in the run-up to the March election as being things that districts need to be prepared for. And so since Prop 13 was not passed, we want to make sure everybody understands for. And so since Prop 13 was not passed, we want to make sure everybody understands these things did not go into effect. So had Prop 13 passed, these things would have gone into effect, but since it didn't, there is no prohibition on assessment of any fees on multifamily housing located within a half-mile of major transit stop. We talked a lot about that at a lot of workshops. Prop 13 passed, there would have been no fees charged on multifamily housing within that half-mile radius. There also would have been a 20% reduction to all other multifamily housing that was beyond that half-mile radius. And there also would have been a suspension of level 3 fees through 2028 or through 2027, ending in 2020. But again, none of these things have taken effect. So that is, again, a little bit of a silver lining through this process. Level 3 fees, that's something that may enter the discussion again as the amount of state bonds authorized for new construction and available dwindles. Other things to talk about, January 2020 is when we saw the last level 1 fee increase, and many districts have completed or in the process of completing their justification studies to enact that higher fee. So you can see the new level 1 rate is $4.08 per square foot for residential construction, commercial industrial construction. This is the maximum amount allowed for level 1 fees. And so in order to adopt that, you have to have a nexus or justification for that fee, mostly done through a fee justification study that is adopted by the board following a public review period of the study as well. And most districts have continued that process this year, but obviously we have some impacts of COVID-19 on public noticing and public meetings. So make sure you work with your legal counsel on making sure the notice of public hearing includes the necessary portions of how the meeting will be conducted, most like this webinar is being conducted. And so to ensure there's the ability for members of the public to provide comment on it, we're also been recommending that districts post their developer fee study draft before it's adopted on their website, since it's supposed to be available for public review for 10 days prior to adoption, members of the community to see it, since they can't come to your offices and pick up a copy. As we try to advance the slide here. Accessory dwelling units, that's been over the last year or two, one of the most frequently asked questions, particularly SB 13, AB 881, and AB 68, that all work together to say that public agencies are prohibited from imposing fees on accessory dwelling units or second homes or granny flats that are under 750 square feet. And one of the things apply to school districts is politically these are being viewed as a way to alleviate some of the housing affordability crisis, provides additional housing opportunities for residents in some of the higher priced areas. But the way that the law is written is a little bit unclear. But the way that the law is written is a little bit unclear as to whether or not public agencies include school districts or does not. So just encourage districts to consult with their legal counsel on the opinion that they have as it relates to the application of this to your district, the opinion that they have as it relates to the application of this to your district. There's just different ways to read public agencies in the government code, and so I just encourage that type of discussion. And finally, looking at maximizing developer fees. One of the things we want to make sure is that, one of the things we want to make sure is that a developer fee study withstands any challenges. So first and foremost, making sure that what is in your developer fee study matches what your actual plans are as a district. If your plans don't include building new schools on new sites, then your Nexus study should not include the idea of building new schools on new sites and should instead look at the cost of expanding existing facilities to make sure that you're accurately capturing the plans of the district. A lot of districts are in declining enrollment, where we know that more than half the districts in California are declining enrollment, and that raises the question of, do we already have enough space to accommodate growth from new residential development, and do we need to expand or add new campuses in order to accommodate growth? So what other things can go into the Nexus study? What other types of projects might looking at modernization or enhancement programs that the district has, and what percent of those or what portion of those are not being covered by a local general obligation bond, and building some of those costs into your developer fee study. Now, we can't talk about maintenance issues, we can't talk about repair issues because those are specifically learning. That may not be adding capacity, but maybe keeping them available to accommodate growth from new development. So we want to look at making sure those types of enhancements and modernizations are included in your developer fee study, if that's what your plans for those dollars include. And finally, to think of developer, we know that quality schools enhance the property values for these new projects that are being built, and that's one of the big selling points for new communities is the quality of the school facilities and schools that they are served by. And so working with your cities and counties, as well as the developers, to explain the providing adequate quality schools to the communities and what the needs of the district are. And the needs of the district are going to be more than just level 1 or level 2 fees. So finding that win-win partnership that can exist with the developers who have an incentive and for the school district as well, and looking at potential alternative funding for the school district as well, and looking at potential alternative financing options, as John Barrissey mentioned with Community Facilities District. That's one option, but there are many others that districts can consider to leverage their developer fees in this time or in any time. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jeff and Julie. In this time or in any time. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jeff and Julie.
All right, let's see if we can get things going here. Okay, that was excellent. Thank you so much. I really would like to do an excellent job. Our next scheduled webinar is next Thursday, April 23rd, and it's Construction Climate under the Governor's Order. I'm going to advance the slide here. Which contractor, subcontractor, workforce supplier, and PPE availability. And we have a 2-part web shop planning for healthy indoor air quality and energy savings through scheduled maintenance. The first part is on Tuesday, April 21st, which includes speakers from the National Energy Management Institute and the California Energy Commission. The second part is Friday, April 24th, completion. Cash, myself, and all the printers on the webinar want today to extend our best wishes for continued good health to you and your family and everyone out there. Cash will continue to keep you informed through emails and webinars as we learn more. Please follow your recommended health out there. Cash will continue to keep you informed through emails and webinars as we learn more. Please follow your recommended health care precautions for your county. And I just continue to be amazed and grateful at the resilience, dedication, and innovation of school industry leaders across recommended health care precautions for your county. And I just continue to be amazed and grateful at the resilience, dedication, and innovation of school industry leaders across the country who are working tirelessly to meet the needs of students and communities during our coronavirus pandemic. I really think it truly showcases communities during our coronavirus pandemic. I really think it truly showcases the power of public education industry in keeping our communities going. So, Jeff, any words before we sign off here?
Well, I echo your sentiment, Julie. And, it's been a pleasure to watch the work of school facility professionals, as well as the food service folks that we spoke with last week. Really is amazing work, and supporting each other, I think, in this time is critical. And thank you for your leadership on the CASH board, and looking forward to working through this and hopefully meeting together in person.
Yeah, that will be great again today. It's something that I was asked a question this morning, and that question is, what's the one thing you think you've learned so far? As I was kind of twisting through there are all kinds of things, like I really dislike wearing face masks and a few things like that. But what really stands out in my mind, I think, is how much we need and miss that social connection, that meeting with people. We are definitely, one of the things is being able to, sit across from someone and talk, and having that close interaction is really something I think I've missed the most from this whole pandemic.
Yeah, I agree, Julie. And with that, I want to wish everybody good health and staying well as we work through this pandemic.
Right, and special thanks to our warriors on the front line, which include our medical field, our truckers, our grocery store employees, our construction, our maintenance workers, our school service lunch ladies who are risking the next maybe Tuesday or next Thursday. Talk to you soon.